Minecraft is super fun to play, right? Until you realize that Steve is actually the most miserable character in the whole game. So get ready, because after learning about Steve's sad life, you'll never see him the same way again. Let's start with the latest buzz, because in the Minecraft movie they showed us a side of Steve we've never seen before, but if we analyze it, it'll break your heart. At first glance, it might seem like Steve has a happy life, not too different from anyone else. But let's be real, nothing is what it seems. Steve is actually a very sad and lonely man. He's unhappy with his life for a number of really tragic reasons. Since he was little, he went through a lot of trauma, which we're gonna break down piece by piece. First of all, let's talk about Steve's biggest trauma. From a young age, Steve realized that he was probably never gonna be able to make friends. He was always the outcast and the misfit, no matter where he went. No one could understand him or stand him. To many people, he was just a tool bag. Just like Natalie said, and everyone hated her.
This guy is such a tool bag.
And that's a key detail to really understand more about Steve's story. The Minecraft movie didn't just want to make us laugh with those comments. If we look at it from a deeper perspective, they're actually showing us what Steve's whole life has been like. He always got made fun of for his ideas and how he acted. His loud personality was unpleasant to others. Everything people said to Steve in the movie was probably also said to him when he was a kid, a teenager, and definitely even as an adult. And maybe because of all those horrible comments, Steve started losing his self-esteem and pulled away from everyone, stopping all social interaction. That would explain really well his lack of social skills we saw in the movie. It's not that Steve wanted to act weird to be funny or to get people to like him. The truth is, he just didn't know how to interact with others. We see him living a pretty boring and lonely life, and I wouldn't be surprised if he'd ever thought about committing suicide. And yeah, that might sound a little dramatic to someone, but wait until we keep digging into his tragic life. One of the saddest details about Steve is that it seems that he has no family or anyone close who actually cared about him. A lot of time passed after Steve went into Minecraft and disappeared, and people cared more about selling and releasing his stuff than asking where he'd gone. Sad, right? Well, hold on, because now we're getting into the most critical point, which is when he enters Minecraft. At first, all Steve does is build like crazy, explore the world, and build even more. Seems normal, right? But what if I told you this actually shows the pain Steve is going through in those moments? When he enters Minecraft, it's like Steve is given a second chance to live his life and finally be happy. That's why he builds a world that looks cheerful and calls it Steve's World. But that's just one side of the coin. Even though he manages to create incredible things, he still feels alone. He even admits it himself when he says he needed a companion.
The only thing missing was a friend to share it with.
And that's where Dennis comes in, a wolf that becomes his only friend. The Minecraft movie made it super clear. Wolves in the game aren't just a coincidence. They're meant to represent how lonely Steve is. Because if you noticed, the wolf had almost the same story as Steve. It's a lonely animal that just needed a little understanding to get close. And that's pretty accurate, because the second friend Steve makes is Garrett, basically another lonely, misunderstood wolf. In the same movie, Steve tells us that the years flew by, and we can see him aging, especially from the gray hairs in his beard and hair. But then, how could someone spend so many years alone without interacting with anyone? In psychology and several studies, it's been shown that this is really hard for most people. Humans are built to have interactions and socialize with other humans. That confirms that for most of his life, Steve was always alone and got used to it. So many years without feeling weird? How is it that this wasn't enough to make him want to return to the real world and leave the Minecraft dimension? Well, I think that also explains why Steve wanted to stay in the Nether. It's not like he got captured or didn't have any way out. If you look closely at the scene where he tells Dennis to hide the artifact, you can clearly see that Steve also had time to escape. But instead, he stays and lets himself get caught. I think he did it on purpose, to be around something that at least kind of resembled human interaction. The piglins. And if you still don't feel sorry for Steve, we have to talk about the end of the movie. Did you notice the only one who really connected with Steve was Garrett? He was pretty much the only one who actually wanted to be his friend. Because really, none of the other characters seemed interested in forming a close relationship with Steve. Garrett was the only one who truly tried to convince Steve to return to the real world and not stay in Minecraft. And besides Garrett, the only other one who kind of considered being Steve's friend was Henry. And we know this from the scene where the Enderman messed with his mind. That's where we saw that he thought of Steve as kind of a friend. But clearly, by the end of the movie, we can see that they didn't really have much interaction after all. The saddest part of all this is that Henry did consider Garrett as a friend. He even admitted it himself. But if you thought that was sad, wait until we dive into how depressing Steve's life is in the Minecraft game. Let's start with the most basic thing, Steve's skin. This is a skin you basically don't even choose for yourself. It's the default one in the game. I think we've rarely ever seen someone excited to have a Steve skin. Usually players want their own custom skin, their favorite YouTubers, or a famous character. But Steve's? I think we can all agree that when we see someone with the Steve skin, we immediately assume they're a noob. Probably a little kid learning how to play Minecraft who has no idea what they're doing. But leaving the skin aside, let's talk about Steve's life in the game. He basically appears in Minecraft just because you started a new game. He spawns alone in an empty world with just a few default structures, and even those don't always generate well. It's like he's the only one of his kind, because villagers don't even come close to being like him. You could say Steve is born to live alone and just build things endlessly with no real purpose. Imagine spawning into Minecraft and having to live there for the rest of your life. And I'm not talking multiplayer here, because like we said, if you see someone with Steve's skin, chances are it's a noob. Very few people actually choose to play as Steve, which just confirms again that he's the outcast. He's pretty much there building forever just to fill a void. Maybe Mojang realized how sad Steve's situation was, and that's why they added Alex, so Steve would finally have some company in that lonely world. Maybe that's what Alex represents at the end of the Minecraft movie, the end of Steve's miserable life, because now, at last, he's not completely alone. The worst part of Steve's life is that he can't even die. He's cursed to live forever in total loneliness. So for Steve, there's no easy way out. In fact, his immortality isn't a blessing, it's more like a curse. Just think about this. How many of us had our first tamed wolf? The one we loved so much and took everywhere with us on adventures. Until one day, it died for some random reason. Steve can respawn, sure, but how do you know the next wolf you tame is the same one? Even if you find a horse, tame it, and it dies, if you find one that looks just like the one you lost, it's not really the same, is it? So Steve just watches everything he loves die around him, while he goes on eternal. But how many of you actually know where Steve comes from in the game? Do you know the sad story behind his name? Steve doesn't really have any official lore. All we know is that he came from a game Notch was working on called Zombie Town. In it, we can see a bunch of Steves running around, though they kind of look more like Herobrine. At the time, Steve didn't even have a name. In fact, in the alpha version of Minecraft, he was just called Zombie. It wasn't until later that players started calling two skins that only lasted for 2 days in Minecraft, White Steve and Black Steve. From there, people began calling a bunch of mobs and items Steve, and that's probably why Notch decided to name the default character Steve. And while that might sound like a cute origin story, imagine your parents didn't know what name to give you and just went with your school nickname. Yeah, That's very sad. Steve's tragic life and situation are even reflected in the sad music you hear in Minecraft. Some people might hear it as a relaxing background music, but for most, after really thinking about it, realize those are incredibly sad songs for the overworld. I'm sure that next time you start a new Minecraft world with the Steve skin, you won't see him the same way again. But then, what's the real purpose of Steve? To answer that question, we have 3 possible explanations, but spoiler alert, none of them have a happy ending. The first one comes from Steve's origin. He was the only survivor of the zombie attack in that old game he came from, and while surviving a zombie apocalypse might sound like a good thing, if you think about it, it's actually super depressing. Basically, his entire family and friends died. And if you don't believe that's sad, it's probably because you haven't seen the movie I Am Legend. Tell me, what purpose would you have if you were the last human alive? You wouldn't even be able to reproduce. The second explanation is even more empty. Steve just spawned into Minecraft with no idea why he's there. He doesn't know what his purpose is, what he's supposed to do, or even why he exists. He's just there, living for the sake of living, stuck in an endless cycle. And that really hits home with the idea that there are fates worse than death. And the last theory says that Steve didn't just show up in Minecraft randomly. His arrival and time in the Minecraft world were planned and well studied. According to this theory, Steve came from another dimension to study the Minecraft world. He shows up and somehow already knows what to do, how to craft tools, build things, and even defeat the Ender Dragon. So yeah, in this theory, Steve does have a purpose, but it's still a sad one. He left everything behind to live in a world where he'll be alone forever, with no guarantee that he'll ever return to the dimension he came from. No matter how you look at it, Steve lives a sad and depressing life. But tell me friends, had you ever really stopped to think about how sad Steve's life is? Let us know in the comments.